Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would review this little video and talk about this particular subject that I personally found very particularly interesting and that ended up piquing my interest. Anyways, the video that I'm about to review is going to be by the boxing channel, known, of course, as DontaesBoxingNation, a channel that I tend to review here and there, especially when we talk about certain narratives that I think a lot of the times can be out of proportion. But of course, for those of you all in all that have not heard the news, as in the recent news, I believe that it was just reported today, or if not today, maybe yesterday, I'm not necessarily sure. But Gennady Triple G Golovkin, who of course was at one point in time, several years ago, maybe even a little bit more than that, at least when he really started to rise into prominence. Gennady Golovkin, who of course was once upon a time one of the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters, he ended up recently relinquishing his title, I believe his WBA middleweight title, overall to not fight his mandatory of also the former great contender, and some may even debate former top 10 pound-for-pound fighter, Mr. Erislandy Lara, when it came down to it. And overall, Gennady Golovkin, of course, he has relinquished, he has vacated his 160-pound title, and this, because Erislandy Lara was the mandatory, this has made Erislandy Lara the official WBA champion of 160 pounds, which of course is going to be a little bit interesting to see what ends up happening with that middleweight picture. It's going to be very particularly interesting, but we'll see what happens. But for a lot of people that have not been around my channel overall for a long time, for some of you that may be recent, and for some of you all in all that maybe don't go as far back in terms of watching boxing, several to 10 years ago, somewhere around there when I was just starting to get into it. And overall, my introduction into boxing came with certain fighters, of course, like a Floyd Mayweather Jr. and a Manny Pacquiao and a Miguel Cotto, but more towards the end of their primes, more towards the end of their careers. Certain fighters overall that I ended up truly growing up with, especially when I first started getting into boxing, were certain fighters overall like that of a Saul Canelo Alvarez, were certain fighters like a Terrence Bud Crawford. Eventually, Errol Spence Jr. would come up a little bit later on the come up. I'm trying to remember if there was any other fighters back in the day. Guillermo Rigondeaux, of course, when it came down to it, even though he was a bit older, but he was still looked at during the prime of his career. Andre Ward, Sergey Kovalev, and Gennady Triple G Golovkin, of course, was one of those fighters, as well as Mr. Erislandy Lara. And Gennady Golovkin, at one point in time, there was a time when he was looked to be one of the best fighters in the world, and he was looked to be debatably, at least in certain people's eyes, the best fighter on the planet. And at that moment in time, you maybe could possibly debate it. I don't think that he ever truly had quite the resume to really be debated as the number one pound-for-pound fighter. But for a lot of you that don't remember, Gennady Golovkin during his time, at least for the 160-pound weight division, he was looked at as one of the biggest boogeymen during his day. Now, whether you agree with that or not, that's up to you. But what I will say is this: Gennady Golovkin, the facts of the situation were this: he did have a very tough time getting certain fighters in the ring with him. And for those of you that don't remember those days or don't remember the facts of the situation, Peter Quillen, who was looked to be at one point in time, maybe the second best middleweight in the world, he was not interested in the Gennady Golovkin fight. Sergio Martinez was not looked to be interested in the Gennady Golovkin fight. Even Miguel Cotto and Canelo Alvarez at one point in time, they did not appear to be super duper interested in that of the Canelo Alvarez fight. And there might even be a couple of others that I'm not personally mentioning. So there is no doubt about it. Gennady Golovkin has had his fair share of fights that have eluded or evaded him because there were certain fighters that did not want to fight him. But just like certain other fighters that I would mention with, Gennady Golovkin did have a couple of fighters that did want to fight him, and that he did not really bite on the opportunity on, possibly because he thought that those fighters would be too much risk for too little reward, especially possibly for that very big payday, either against Miguel Cotto or Canelo Alvarez. And of course, for those of you that remember that fight, Canelo Alvarez, of course, ended up being the unanimous decision victor in that very decent fight when it came down to it, of course, where Canelo pretty much completely outboxed Miguel Cotto. But anyways, when it came down to it all in all, Gennady Golovkin at one point in time, there was one fighter, especially from that of the 154-pound weight division, that did offer to fight him. And for those of you overall that don't remember who that fighter was, it was Mr. Erislandy Lara. And I remember it overall just like it was yesterday. And Gennady Golovkin did always seem a little bit tentative to fight Erislandy Lara, because I think that he and his trainer Abel Sanchez thought that he was worth way too much trouble than what he was actually worth, or that he was way too much trouble than what he was actually worth. And Erislandy Lara was a boogeyman in his own right. The Charlo brothers did not seem super interested in fighting him. They never mentioned his name when they were down at 154 pounds. Even Demetrius Bubu Andre, there was a couple of times where he called out Erislandy Lara, but then when actually things came overall to the occasion, when it came down to, when it actually came to possibly fighting that of an Erislandy Lara, the fight did not end up happening. And I believe that Demetrius Bubu Andre, that he even went as far to say that he didn't want the fight because it would be a quote-unquote boring fight. At least I remember a certain article and a quote saying that about Demetrius Bubu Andre. And I believe it ended up being proven true. But I would have to, do a little bit more research on it. So both of these men did have overall their reputation of being boogeymen throughout their day. But Gennady Golovkin, overall, with the type of career that he has had when it came down to it, in my opinion, it could have been a little bit greater had he overall took certain fights that maybe all in all, in my opinion, that he did not take. And that Erislandy Lara fight, sure, all in all, Erislandy Lara isn't looked at as a guy that necessarily is an all-time great fighter. But he was an extraordinary fighter during his day. He was a fighter, all in all, that was an extraordinary contender. Someone that one could actually argue that he should be undefeated. One could argue that. One could argue that he could have won the Canelo Alvarez fight. One could have argued that he could have won the Jarrett Hurd fight. And he certainly didn't lose to Paul Williams. Probably the worst robbery that I've ever seen, that Paul Williams versus Erislandy Lara fight. But Dante's Boxing Nation, he's going to talk about the recent news with that of Gennady Golovkin. He's also going to talk about the career of Gennady Golovkin. And, of course, the career of Canelo Alvarez, because why not add Canelo Alvarez to a conversation, even if it has nothing to do with him? And I've already said this. The reason why Dante talks about certain fighters like Gennady Golovkin and Canelo Alvarez so often is because right now Canelo Alvarez, he's pretty much enemy number one for them. He's mainly in their hit sites. He's mainly overall in their marksman, in their, mark sites, whatever it's called. He's basically overall in their gun sites. That is the main target for that new media, because they understand that Canelo Alvarez has the resume, that he pretty much has the full package. And I'm not saying that I disagree with every point that they say about Canelo Alvarez, but the way that they talk about him, overall, you can tell that they know that Canelo is a truly special fighter. I don't think that there's any debate about it. But Dante's going to talk about both Gennady Golovkin and Canelo Alvarez. I don't believe he's actually going to talk about Erislandy Lara, but I thought overall that I would talk about it because I thought it'd be very particularly interesting. But anyways, Dante is going to speak his piece. Let's get into it.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So Gennady Golovkin, he does it again. He just recently vacated his IBF belt, and now he vacates his WBA belt to avoid his mandatory Erislandy Lara. Now Erislandy...
And apparently, Erislandy Lara was not the only fighter that he vacated to. Apparently, there was an undefeated Brazilian fighter. I believe he's like 30-0. Could have been a very potentially tough fight for Gennady Golovkin. So Gennady Golovkin does not appear to be very interested in fighting other top contenders. On top of that, he's about 40-some years old. In my opinion, that pretty much would be the perfect time to retire. Now, what level is Gennady Golovkin on in terms of greatness, or, would I put him as an all-time great fighter? That's another conversation, and I'll be talking about that as the video progresses.
Lara has been elevated to the full WBA champion because Golovkin waves the white flag again.
And as for Erislandy Lara, I hope that he's decently successful at the 160-pound weight division. For those of you overall that don't know or haven't been around me, Erislandy Lara was one of my personal favorite defensive fighters, or one of my favorite fighters overall to watch throughout the early 2010s. Unfortunately, in my opinion, his career probably could have ended up a little bit better than what it ended up, but I will say that at times on the Erislandy Lara, there were certain fights that did elude him. In my opinion, what Lara probably should have did is that he probably should have went up to 160 a very, very long time ago, because it did not appear that the Charlo brothers were particularly interested in him. Demetrius Bubu Andre really did not seem particularly interested in him. Gennady Golovkin did not really seem a particular amount interested in him. But Lara, maybe had he won a certain amount of titles at 160 pounds, he could have not only became a factor, possibly for the Canelo Alvarez or Gennady Golovkin fight, he could have possibly became a factor once again for Demetrius Bubul Andrade or one of the Charlo brothers, because they eventually were going to make their move up there. But unfortunately, Lara, he just never usually moved out of the 154-pound weight division. So,
renders his belt to Erislandy Lara. You know, it's really funny when Canelo Alvarez fans, they try to compare Canelo to Floyd Mayweather, when we all know the reality is the only thing that Golovkin or the only thing that Canelo has in common with Floyd Mayweather is that they're both boxers. Now, when it comes to Golovkin and Canelo,
I really don't know what Canelo Alvarez really has to do with this conversation. It's been 47 seconds into the video, and the man is mainly talking about Canelo Alvarez within this video. The video is about Gennady Golovkin and Erislandy Lara. But it is what it is. Listen, bottom line is this. Just to overall give my little short analysis on Canelo Alvarez, it's very clear, if you know what you're talking about, that Canelo Alvarez is an all-time great boxer. Both Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Canelo Alvarez, they're both all-time great boxers. Do I believe that Floyd is on another level and greater than Canelo Alvarez? Yes, of course I believe that, but at the end of the day, Canelo Alvarez has proved his mark. He's proved that he's an all-time great fighter, and I've said this repeatedly. You can't have fighters like Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith, Caleb Plant, Danny Jacobs, Gennady Golovkin, Erislandy Lara, Sergey Kovalev, Miguel Cotto, all these other guys on your resume. You can't have all those guys, Austin Trout, and not be an all-time great fighter. And on top of that, completely unify a weight division, be a great skilled, both great defensively and offensively, become a 4-weight division champion, and this guy is just an average Mexican fighter that Dante overall tries to allege. Like, come on.
they have almost everything in common. They both avoided Jamal Charles.
And the thing overall with Gennady Golovkin is that unfortunately for him, partially his fault and partially not his fault, I don't know if Gennady Golovkin is really ever going to be remembered as a truly all-time great fighter. I think that he is a great fighter. I would give him the distinction of great. But I don't know if I would ever really call Gennady Golovkin an all-time great fighter, at least when you talk about the top 20. Now, some people, all in all, they may disagree when it comes down to it. But, Gennady Golovkin, at the end of the day, the biggest win of his career, it was against Danny Jacobs. He did run through a certain amount of those contenders at 160 pounds. But a lot of those guys at 160 pounds, not saying that all of them were just completely tomato cans, but a lot of them clearly were not on his same level.
Carlo and Demetrius Andrade, and both of them are going for the record when it comes to vacating titles. Lara has been calling out Gennady Golovkin for...
Listen, what I'll say is this. In my opinion, when it comes to the Jamal Charlo and Demetrius Bubul Andrade situation, I get more on Gennady Golovkin's case than what I do Canelo's. Because first of all, I believe at one point in time, actually, it was reported that Canelo Alvarez had sent a contract to that of Jamal Charlo, but Jamal Charlo turned it down. And I believe overall that was actually proven, or Jamal Charlo, he never denied that claim. So when it came down to it, no, that could possibly be true. But on top of that, Canelo Alvarez has moved up the weight divisions. He's fought repeated A-grade fighters. Certain fighters that you could debate are possibly even above or right on the same level as that is a Jamal Charlo, maybe even a Demetrius Bubul Andrade. In my opinion, Caleb Plant, not only is he just as good as Jamal Charlo, he's probably a little bit better than what Jamal Charlo ever was, just in terms of overall that slick style and what he can do. Certain people aren't going to like that, but it just is what it is. Once again, I've just seen Jamal Charlo fight a little bit too often. I think that he's a little bit too flawed to really beat someone like that of a Canelo Alvarez. But Gennady Golovkin certainly could have fought Jamal Charlo at a different time. And yes, he did avoid that fight. As for the Demetrius Bubul Andrade fight, Gennady Golovkin also was not interested in that fight. And Canelo Alvarez, of course, I believe that he has thought that Demetrius Bubul Andrade, that he's a little bit too much trouble for what he's really worth. So Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, it is obvious that Demetrius Bubul Andrade fight, it does not particularly interest him. That is the one fight that I think you can say that maybe Canelo Alvarez has eluded, but pretty much every other fight, like I said, a lot of these guys, they want to say overall, oh, he's ducking, all the, greatest competitors. All that is a bunch of bullshit. Canelo Alvarez has fought repeated A-grade fighters ever since overall he's gotten to the Austin Trout level. For the past 7 to 9 years, Canelo Alvarez has been facing usually repeated A-grade fighters. Now, that doesn't mean that every now and then that there's not going to be a Rocky Fielding or an Avni Yildirim. But once again, I give Canelo Alvarez a great amount of credit. because what he's usually shown me is that he's usually repeatedly going to get in there with A-grade level competition.
For years, I'm talking about over 8 years, he's been calling him out. And just to show you how blatant the ducking was, Golovkin, he wouldn't fight Erislandy Lara, but he decided instead to fight Willie Monroe, which was a southpaw just like Erislandy Lara.
Well, listen, what I'm going to say is this. Willie Monroe at one point in time may have been a mandatory. I can't really remember. Do I think that Willie Monroe was on the level of Erislandy Lara? No, of course not. But at the end of the day, my biggest gripe with that situation is this. Gennady Golovkin, and you get certain fighters that are like this, and I say the same thing about Demetrius Bubu Andrade and Jamal Charlo and some of these other fighters that claim that they're so ducked and so avoided, and it turns Bud Crawford and certain other fighters. And with Gennady Golovkin, it's the same situation for me. You know, if you're claiming that you're being so ducked and you're so avoided and you're willing to fight anybody, almost every fighter says that until they actually have to fight a fighter that, you know, they think overall might be a little bit too much trouble for what they're worth. When it comes to Canelo Alvarez, you can say that there's certain fights that have not occurred that should have happened, but you know that Canelo Alvarez is usually going to get in there with a fighter that's usually a decent replacement or about on the same level. Gennady Golovkin, when it came down to it, he could have easily fought Erislandy Lara, in my opinion, and that would have been a great fight. In my opinion, would have done a decent amount of numbers. Now, would it have done the numbers of Canelo Alvarez, versus Gennady Golovkin? No, of course not. But at the end of the day, it would have been a great fight, in my opinion. It was always a personal dream fight of mine. I loved to watch both Erislandy Lara and Gennady Golovkin back in the day, and I think that their styles, with Gennady Golovkin mainly being the great pressure fighter that he is, and with Lara being the mainly great defensive and slick fighter that he was, I think all in all that it would have been a tremendous fight. Truly would have been a tremendous fight. If you're asking me, in my opinion, who do I think probably would have won, I probably would have went with Gennady Golovkin. I think that more than likely that he would have hit Erislandy Lara eventually, and that more than likely he probably would have got him in the corner. And I'm not going to 100% say knocked him out, but probably overall, maybe would have knocked him down a couple times and probably overall would have got him, but who knows. Either way, Gennady Golovkin would have been one hell of a test for Erislandy Lara, and Lara would have been one hell of a test for Gennady Golovkin. But unfortunately, because of Gennady Golovkin, that fight never happened.
The only difference is he didn't have any power at all. I think at the time he had like about 4 or 6 knockouts. That's who Golovkin chose to fight, and actually Willie Monroe turned out to be one of Golovkin's toughest fights at that point in his career, which was even more of a reason for Gennady Golovkin to avoid Lara. Gennady Golovkin is no longer...
I don't think that Gennady Golovkin really took Willie Monroe quite as seriously. And that's not me overall trying to say, excuses for that. Maybe it was just because Willie Monroe. Maybe it was just because he had a little bit of a different style. But when it came down to Willie Monroe, in my opinion, he was a decent fighter. He was never a great fighter. Gennady Golovkin, when it came down to it, I think that he kind of led Willie Monroe. I'm not going to say that he let him hit him over a little bit more, but I don't think that Gennady Golovkin overall, that he put on the pressure quite as much in that fight, and I think that he was kind of playing with him. Just in my personal opinion.
Longer signed to DAZN, he's a free agent as of now. And if he wants to make some good money, he's going to have to fight one of the tough opponents that he's been avoiding his entire career. The only fighter that Golovkin wanted to fight that actually was someone that was undefeated and had a name was obviously Canelo Alvarez. Golovkin could see that Canelo Alvarez was a very flawed fighter, and that's why he wanted that big payday. It made all the sense in the world.
And of course, DontaesBoxingNation is going to go with the narrative, and he always tries to make Canelo Alvarez sound like he's just some average Mexican fighter. This is why once again I'd like to review certain videos by Dante, because I don't necessarily disagree with every single point that he says, but he takes it way, way, way too far. He takes it way, way, way too far. He's almost like one of those super liberals or super conservatives when it comes down to where they may have certain points that you agree with, but then all of a sudden they just come out with something overall out of left field, out of nowhere, and it's just like, whoa, where the hell did that come from? When it came down to it. Dante, once again, has some of the stupidest opinions that I've ever seen, at least overall when it comes to his certain extremism. And don't get me wrong, like I said, overall, I don't disagree with every single point that Dante puts out there. But he acts like Canelo Alvarez is just some like Brandon Figueroa or some shit. Like, dude, Canelo Alvarez is one of the greatest and most skilled fighters of all time. You can admit that all you want to. Excuse me. You can not admit that all you want to. But those are the facts at the end of the day. Once again, you can't have the names on your resume that Canelo Alvarez has and just be a hype job or just be an average Mexican fighter. At the end of the day, the facts are the facts of the situation. The only Mexican fighter that I really, realistically might put over Canelo Alvarez would be Chavez. That's really about it.
Thought he picked the perfect flawed fighter,
And some will not even put Chavez over Canelo.
He ends up losing. When you call someone out for years and it's a signature fight, you're supposed to win that fight because that's supposed to be the most important fight of your legacy.
Well, hold on a minute here, Dante, because according to you, what I always hear is that we can't even count that fight for Canelo because a lot of people thought Gennady Golovkin won that fight. This is also another reason why I like to review these videos, because if you're a person, overall, once again, that, people always say this shit about Canelo Alvarez all the time. I was actually having a debate overall in the comment section with someone about this, and overall he was saying overall, oh, well, Canelo Alvarez, a lot of people thought that he truly lost the fight and blah, blah, blah. A lot of these guys, when they don't like a particular fighter, they'll use overall the, oh, it was so controversial or it was so close that we can't count it. But then when they're with their favorite fighters, they don't use the same shit. So which one is it? Did Canelo Alvarez, should he have lost that fight? Because depending on the day, Dante overall will tell you one day that Gennady Golovkin lost that fight and that he was a complete big white hype. And then another day, when he's trying to tear down Canelo Alvarez, he'll say, oh, well, Gennady Golovkin really got robbed. It was just because of Canelo Alvarez's name that he ended up winning that fight. So Dante, which one is it?
It's no different than Muhammad Ali constantly calling out Sonny Liston, Floyd Mayweather for years calling out Oscar De La Hoya, or even Devin Haney calling out Vasily Lomachenko. Regardless of what we think about the decision, Gennady Golovkin, he was not supposed to allow the fight to be that close in the first place. Just like Floyd Mayweather, he didn't allow...
Well, listen, dude, I understand if you're going to compare him to Floyd Mayweather Jr., but listen, not everyone is Floyd Mayweather Jr. They're two fighters overall in the ring. It was looked at as a 50-50 matchup when they came in. Let's not overall criticize anyone at least super duper hard for it not being super duper far apart. Now, you can criticize Gennady Golovkin for not winning the rematch and not doing as good as what maybe, you can say that he should have. But I'm not really going to overall criticize anyone for the fight being super competitive because Canelo Alvarez is a generational type of fighter. Yes, Mayweather was able to be dominant over Canelo Alvarez, but Canelo Alvarez at that time, not only was he a little bit more at a natural weight for himself at 160 pounds, and he was not drained in that fight like what he was in the Floyd Mayweather Jr. fight when it came down to it. And that's not me making excuses, but that's just, it is what it is when it came down to it, because Canelo, I believe, was at a rehydration clause. And on top of that, he had become a little bit of a better fighter because the Floyd Mayweather Jr. fight, overall in a multitude of other fights that he had, I believe he had about several more fights on his record. So Canelo was starting to come into his own. At that time, all in all, he had fought for certain fighters like Chavez Jr. and Lara. After that, he had fought certain guys like, I believe Amir Khan and who the hell's the other fighter that I'm forgetting? Who's that one fighter that, damn it, there's one overall that oh yeah, Miguel Cotto. He fought Miguel Cotto all before Gennady Golovkin. Now, some of you may be like, what the hell are you talking about? Amir Khan overall and Chavez Jr., those are not elite fighters. And you can certainly claim that, but my point being is this: Canelo Alvarez was building overall his skill set and starting to adjust as a fighter as the time went along.
Wow, the Canelo Alvarez fight to be close at all, and there was still a judge that had the fight a draw. Do you guys remember there was a time when old media was saying that Golovkin was pound for pound the best fighter in the world, and he's top 25, one of the greatest fighters of all time? And we're talking about...
Well, I remember overall people saying that he was one of the top 25 fighters of the past 25 years, which you could make a debate about if you wanted to. I don't really remember anyone claiming that he was a top 25 fighter of all time. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked because, of course, he had more middleweight defenses than that of Marvin Hagler and a certain amount of other fighters at the middleweight division. But I do agree with Dante there. In my opinion, Gennady Golovkin, because of his resume, he cannot be necessarily remembered as a top 20 or a top 30 fighter of all time.
About a fighter who avoided...
Now, the question is, where is Gennady Golovkin in terms of greatness? I would rank him overall. If I overall were to rank him, I'm really trying to think overall where I would personally rank him. Maybe you could put him in the Eric Morales and Marco Antonio Barrera territory if you wanted to. So he'd be, probably in the top 100 fighters of all time. What I will say is this, and a lot of people may not agree with me on this. Gennady Golovkin and Mike Tyson, they're probably closer overall than what a lot of people would be willing to admit. Because a lot of people, including DontaesBoxingNation, they always like to call a certain fighter like Mike Tyson all-time great. But is Mike Tyson really all-time great? He was a guy all in all that had a great amount of all-time great defenses. He had all-time great accomplishments, but he didn't really have an all-time great resume. What I'll say is this: you could compare Gennady Golovkin and Mike Tyson head to head, and you could possibly debate that Gennady Golovkin would beat out Mike Tyson at the end of the day, and not everyone would agree with that. But at the end of the day, Mike Tyson was a guy that pretty much lost every big fight in his career, and every time that he did, not only did he lose the fight, he pretty much ended up getting his ass kicked. At least with Gennady Golovkin, I can say that he won that very big fight over Danny Jacobs when he was the number one contender, and that was looked at as a 50-50 fight. He pulled out of that fight, and then the Canelo first fight, he probably should have won, but, let's be real, Canelo kind of got a gift, and then in the second fight, you still could debate that it could have won either way. So at least you can debate that with Gennady Golovkin.
Andre Ward avoided Erislandy Lara for, like I said, damn near over 8 years. He avoided James DeGale, who was calling him out aggressively. And then he started to avoid Jamal Charlo and Demetrius Andrade.
I completely overall forgot about James DeGale. James DeGale, the 168-pound English champion during that time, throughout the early to mid 2010s, I believe, who had fought, one of the Durrell brothers. Both of those brothers, in my opinion, were always a little bit overrated. They were always pumped up a little bit because they were black American fighters overall when it came down to it. But they were, and that's not me saying that they were big black hypes or anything like that. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. But there was a certain amount of people overall, including some of these channels that really liked them or kind of hyped them up. But they never really super duper impressed. They were both very decent fighters, but they were never really great fighters, in my opinion. And that's why Andre Durrell, I believe, and then of course there's Anthony Durrell, who lost to Caleb Plant and David Benavidez, and a couple of other guys, I believe. Andre Durrell, he ended up losing to both Carl Froch, I believe. I think some people said that was a controversial decision, but I would have to watch it. And then of course he ended up losing to James DeGale in a very tough fight.
Jim Lampley, HBO's Jim Lampley, who was one of Gennady Golovkin's biggest fans, he actually said, going into the second fight with Canelo Alvarez, if Golovkin loses that fight, his entire career is a failure. And Gennady Golovkin, he lost the rematch to Canelo Alvarez. Regardless of what some people may...
I understand what Jim Lampley and Dante are saying there. I think that personally that's going a little bit too far. But I understand overall what people are saying. That if you're a guy that has that much acclaim overall behind them, that you should be able to win the biggest fight of your career.
Think of the decision. This is the bottom line. You have to realize when Floyd Mayweather fought Canelo Alvarez, Canelo was 15 to 20 pounds bigger than him. He was 23 years old, the exact same age that Devin Haney is today, and Devin Haney is about to fight Vasyl Lomachenko, who's actually younger than Floyd Mayweather was.
Yeah, but by a year. And once again, it's very interesting that Floyd Mayweather Jr. was apparently this grandpa who wasn't regularly himself, even though that probably was the best version of Floyd that I've ever seen, just in terms of a defensive standpoint. That probably is the best performance, at least over a true A-plus fighter, when it came down to that I can remember in Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s career. That was debatably the best performance that I've ever seen him have, just in terms of the all-around ability that he ended up showing. And he was still the number one pound-for-pound fighter. But Lomachenko, who's 35, if you try to bring up the age thing, apparently it's an excuse. Which, listen, I get it to a degree. If you're going to be consistent, then I would agree with you. But Dante overall loves to bring up certain excuses with certain fighters that he likes, but with certain fighters that he doesn't like, he doesn't keep the same standards. So that's why, once again, a lot of times, just no offense against Dante, like I said, I don't think he always brings up bad points, but a lot of times he's also full of shit.
With all of these disadvantages that Floyd Mayweather had, physical disadvantages, Floyd Mayweather completely dominated Canelo Alvarez. Canelo Alvarez. Golovkin was actually bigger than Canelo Alvarez and still struggled in all of the fights that they had with each other. Can you imagine if Floyd Mayweather was naturally bigger than Canelo Alvarez when they fought? Can you imagine what Floyd would have did to Canelo? Floyd would have stopped Canelo Alvarez.
Well, I'm glad that you said that Canelo Alvarez was bigger, because what these guys a lot of the times, including DontaesBoxingNation, will try to tell you in order to bring down Canelo Alvarez is that, oh, Canelo, he only beat these fighters when they were old or when they weren't the same. All this other bullshit. And like I said, this is why you can't really trust a lot of the times what Dante says. Because one day he'll tell you this if he's trying to tear down Gennady Golovkin, and then another day he'll tell you that, oh, well, Gennady got robbed. He only fought Gennady when he was older, when he was in decline. You can't have it both ways, dude. It just is what it is. But when it came down to it, I'm glad that you said that Gennady Golovkin was a bit bigger. He probably was a bit bigger. They probably were around the same weight in terms of it. They probably really, in terms of weight, were probably around the same thickness. But Gennady Golovkin, I believe, was a bit lengthier in terms of the reach, or, somewhere around there. You could debate that Gennady was slightly bigger. So that shows you the skill set that Canelo Alvarez has, because even in certain fights, not even against Golovkin, but certain fights like Caleb Plant or Callum Smith, when it came down to it, or Danny Jacobs, those guys, they're still decently bigger than Canelo Alvarez. And he was able to outbox all those guys.
If he was naturally bigger than him. And it just goes to show you how much of a joke Gennady Golovkin's career is. This man had told everyone that he would fight anyone from 154 to 168. At the time, Andre Ward was pound for pound #1, the best fighter in the world. And instead of going after Andre Ward, Gennady Golovkin, he calls out a 37 or 38-year-old Floyd Mayweather, who's fighting at 147. So the only question is, when it comes to Golovkin and Canelo Alvarez, because they have so much in common, who really is the most overrated out of the two? I'll let you.
And that really was the main point of this video. Not only overall to tear down Gennady Golovkin's career, but to tear down Canelo Alvarez's career. I wonder if the same conversation is going to pop up overall in 10 years about Deontay Wilder's career. Because, of course, Deontay Wilder, he has no wins over any true A-grade fighters, and he ended up getting dominated in each and every big fight that he was in against Tyson Fury. I wonder if the same conversation is going to come up. I highly doubt it. But listen, what I will say is this. Some of the points that Dante is bringing up in terms of Gennady Golovkin not accepting certain fights, I do tend to agree with. Now, is every single fight overall that didn't happen Gennady Golovkin's fault? No. But like I said, there were certain fights that Gennady could have took in his career, like that of the Lara fight, that in my opinion would have improved his career at least a little bit. Because Lara was a true A-grade fighter. He was a true A-grade fighter back in the day. When I say back in the day, of course, I mean about 10 years ago, 7 years ago. Now I think Lara, even though he still has that boxing ability, his legs are pretty much done. His legs are gone. And a big part of Lara's boxing style is his legs, because he mainly fights on the back foot. But we'll see overall what ends up happening.
Guys, figure that out on your own. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
But anyways, that's really about it for today. As for Mr. Canelo Alvarez, we already know my opinions about him, and overall pretty much the facts of the situation. He is an all-time great fighter. We'll see overall how all-time great he's going to be in the Dimitri Bivol rematch, and also potentially against Charlo and David Benavidez. I think that Canelo Alvarez, if he's at his best, that David Benavidez and Jamal Charlo, that more than likely he's going to win those fights. But the Dimitri Bivol fight, that's a different challenge altogether. So we'll see what ends up happening with that fight. But anyways, that was pretty much about it. I just thought overall that was very particularly interesting. As for Gennady Golovkin, great fighter, but unfortunately, in my opinion, because of his lack of a resume, and also just his work within one weight division, I cannot really call him an all-time great fighter. Or, if you want to call him an all-time great fighter, maybe you could. But I can't necessarily claim that he's in the same conversation as a Sugar Ray Leonard. I can't really claim that he's in the same conversation as that overall of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. or a Canelo or a Manny Pacquiao, or, anywhere from the top 10 to top 30 of all time. I can't really claim that because I don't think that he has a resume, unfortunately for him, but some of that overall he has to blame on himself. So it is what it is. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.